Believe, if I remember my history correct, Memorial Day started in remembering Civil War guys that had died in the war, which is interesting because we fought with ourselves, and I almost feel like that's coming back to bite us. Eric, try and keep flipping it till it decides to wake up, or maybe I have to do something. But now we remember all those that fought in various wars. I happen to be reading two books, which is interesting, in two different parts of my house. One's about the Korean War, and one's about the Iraqi time we were in Iraq to set, what was it called, Iraqi freedom, kind of something, about a team of Navy SEALs that went in. We have some of the most elite forces in the world that God has blessed us with, but they will lay down their life in a moment's notice, and I want to recognize those that at some point have given their lives for us. And we must remember them. This isn't a time to walk around and say, Happy Memorial Day. It's time to remember these guys. And as we go through our days, they're often forgotten unless they're close to us. But throughout at least this country's history, we have had men fight for us, so we do not have to go in that warfare. And with that being said, let's go to John 21. John 21. I thought it was kind of irony that we're in John 21 today, when a lot of people seem to be going to hit the lake and go fishing. So we're going to hit the lake and go fishing. I have taught John 21 a couple of times, and I have fought with various things all these times in this chapter because it's a little confusing, and I'm a guy that has a lot to do with words, and I think words are important. And when we get to the part where Peter and Jesus are having a discussion, we're going to talk about words and what do they mean. But what I want to do first this morning is remind you all how many appearances Jesus has already had. This is probably, John 21 is probably 40 days after the resurrection. The reason I say probably, because it doesn't actually say in the text how long after it was. But we will see that within this text, Jesus seems to be giving his commissioning, or basically what they are to do, specifically in this case Peter, and then Jesus will ascend. And the book of John's over kind of thing, and where most of the Gospels will end. So let's kind of review quickly and briefly, whatever, the appearances of Jesus thus far. First of all was to Mary Magdalene in John 20. Then to the women on their way back to the disciples from the tomb. So Mary had probably gone ahead of them, and the rest of the women now are on the road back. I'm not trying to say Mary outran them, but Mary outran them. They were probably older group, so they weren't running anyway. Matthew 28 brings that up. To Peter, and the reason I put Peter with the question mark, or double question mark, because this is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:5. And the disciples on the road to Emmaus said that he had appeared to Peter, but there's no actual occurrence in the Gospels of him appearing to Peter other than what we're going to discuss this morning. But this is probably a prior occurrence. To the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, then to the 10 disciples minus Thomas, and then to the 11, Thomas is now back in the room. We've talked about that last week and this week. And now we're at the Sea of Tiberias or Galilee, and there's only 7 disciples mentioned here. Where the other ones are, I'm not sure. The text doesn't tell us. They could be there, and the focal point are the 7 that went fishing. It does talk about 7 going fishing. Where the other 4 are, they may have been on the shore reading a good book, getting a suntan. I don't know, but text doesn't tell us. Then we have more appearances to come. We have at least 500 brethren that are mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:6. Then to James, the half-brother of Jesus, in 1 Corinthians 15:7. Then 11 disciples on Galilee on the mountain, which we will finish our time in Matthew there. So it's coming soon to a theater near you. And then to the 11 disciples. Wow, first typo today. It's not in Luke 224, even though Luke wrote a lot. The disciples at the ascension in Luke 24, 50 through 53, and Acts 1, 4, and 9. So that's kind of what's left to go here. So I want to read, I put in here all of John, but I'm just going to read for where we're starting in John chapter 21, 1 through 5, let's go 1 through 8. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. They were together, Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will also come with you." They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when this day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus therefore said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find a catch." They cast therefore, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. That disciple therefore whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And so when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 100 yards, dragging net full of fish. So that's where we're going to head this morning. I don't know how far we're going to get, but I find it kind of interesting. Let me blow through this. J. Vernon McGee says this about this section. This is an amazing group here. I like to call this the Convention of the Problem Children. Here is Simon Peter, fervent but failing, warm-hearted yet walking afar off. He is impulsive, impetuous, and affectionate. Then here is Thomas, that magnificent skeptic who has a question mark for a brain, which I don't agree with, but I just think it's interesting what he says. Nathanael the wisecracker, who was also a doubter at the beginning. The sons of thunder, James and John, and 2 others who are not named. Perhaps since this is a crowd of problem children, they represent you and me, which, again, it's J. Vernon McGee. He wants to find application, which is fine. I just think it's interesting that he calls it a convention of the problem child. And that's how it seems to come across, and we're going to kind of look at it like that and discuss some things here. But I do want to look at this section because I believe it's an occasion to build our faith. We're going to look at what happens with Peter and what's going on with that, what's going on in the whole thing. But I want to kind of focus briefly on this idea of manifested, because he uses this word in the first verse here that after these things Jesus manifested himself. And in your side column, if you have a New American Standard Bible that has a side column translation, it says made himself visible. That's okay, but that's not exactly what's being happening here. This word is used twice here, and it's important because Jesus is giving a revelation of himself. The word here has to do with a self-revelation which reveal or discloses who he is. He wants his disciples to firmly understand who he is. And these manifestations are to prove who he is. So in John 21, we have before us what Jesus does at Tiberias that displays to his disciples who he is. We have a display. And so many fun things are in this chapter to me. I just find it funny because most guys, when I was younger, a day of fishing was a day of usually drowning bait, right? I did a couple of times, I did competitive dolphin fishing. Now, for those that don't know what that is, I wasn't hunting for flipper, okay? Dolphin is also known as mahi-mahi in the Pacific. In Florida, it's dolphin, okay? Even though there's a flipper called dolphin called flipper that's in Florida and used to be in the back of the Miami Dolphins stadium in the fish tank. So that was, but that's confusing. The reason I'm saying that is because usually a day of fishing is not always successful, okay? And we see that with these disciples. They went out to do something. Was it wrong or right? We're going to discuss all those things. Were they doing this to avoid any of their immediate concerns that Jesus had given them? And I don't think so, not yet. And we'll see all these things. We're going to see what happens with Peter. Does he not understand that he has a love for Jesus and Jesus has a love for... What's going on with that? And we'll discuss all those things as we get there. When we talk about the word manifested, though, the previous uses of this word in John shows that Jesus revealed himself to Israel. One of those revelations, he was showing to Israel who he was. Who was he to Israel? He was their coming king. He was presenting his coming kingdom, and he was the king, so that they may know that he was the one. And how did he do that? He displayed his glory, his very being of who he is in various signs. We discussed that in the end of last class. Jesus does works again to display who he is. In another place, throughout the Gospel of John, in another place, Jesus heals a blind man who was born that way from birth. We talked about that again in the last class. So people, why did he heal this man who was born blind? Why did he heal him? So people could see who he truly is and his glory. So what in this chapter does Jesus manifest about himself? That's what we've got to ask. That's the key to this chapter, to understanding what Jesus is going to reveal about himself. In John 21, he has a focus on that Jesus is the risen Messiah. He's alive. That's what we're talking about throughout these last couple of weeks. We've been talking about the resurrected Jesus. John is, according to verse 1, showing his readers how Jesus reveals himself to his disciples, specifically to a guy named Peter. So let's talk about the Sea of Tiberias. Here's a beautiful picture of it. So if you're looking out, I believe this is looking out from, you're on the western border looking out towards that, and I believe that city out there that you can see off the hill is Capernaum. So kind of can see it. So I think this was taken outside of kibbutz that was in that area. If you want a better picture of the Sea of Galilee, that's how it looks from way up. It's an interesting sea, and I'll talk about that for a few minutes because I have good comparisons to look at this. And this is the place of the manifestation of Jesus. It's called the Sea of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee. John refers to the Sea of Tiberias 3 times, and no other writer even uses that term, which I'm not going to spend time on. Why does John use Sea of Tiberias and everybody else calls it the Sea of Galilee? I don't think it's that important. But the Emperor Tiberius had set up a place. I don't know if you could see it here. Yeah, right there. You see Tiberias? So the sea picks up its name from a city that the emperor built for himself on the coast of the sea. Really good place. Where do you want your house built? I want it on a lake. That's his lake house. So Tiberius had a lake house out there. So the sea then picked up the name from him. In the Old Testament, this sea is referred to as Chinneroth, spelt various ways in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's called Lake Kinneret or Gennesaret. It's called Tiberias. It's called the Sea. It's called the Sea of Galilee. It's a pear. You can see it's kind of a pear-shaped sea. It's 12.5 miles long, and at its widest, where the pear becomes a pear, is about 8.1 miles at its longest. At its deepest, it's 144 feet deep. It's set 680 feet below sea level. So you got to go down below sea level to actually get into the sea. And then it goes 144 feet down, but its average depth is about 84 feet. This feeds the Jordan River through this sea, both in the northern and I don't know if you can see it. It's real large up there. That's the Jordan, and that's the Jordan. So, how wide? About 8.1 miles. That's its widest. Now, for a comparison, for me, so my hypothesis is whatever city you were near is what you called the lake. Okay, so if you were a fisherman from Capernaum, you'd probably call it the lake Sea of Galilee. but that's just a hypothesis. For instance, I grew up in Florida, and Florida has one of the biggest lakes there is. It's called Lake Okeechobee. Anybody ever heard that? If you see a picture of Florida, there's a big water hole in the middle. That's called Okeechobee. Its original name, even though Okeechobee sounds Indian, its original name is Hatachi. Basically, in I think it's Mississippian, means big water, which is pretty good because at its widest length, it's 35 miles wide, 35 miles long and 28 miles wide. It is 18 feet above sea level when you get to it. And it is depths, ready for this? 14 feet. It's just a big watering hole. That's all it is. I will tell you this, the gators are big. So I would suggest if you go into it, take something. Here's other names for it. Ready for this? It's called the lake. So if you're in Florida and you say, what are you doing? I'm going to the lake. There's only one place you're going. Okay? That's pretty much it. I fished it a couple of times. When you say I fished Lake Okeechobee, you were just in a spot. You never fished the whole lake kind of thing. It's called Florida's Inland Sea. It's called the Big O. It's called Miami. Sound familiar? It's called Myoko Lake. I don't know where that came from, but I just know the names. The reason I bring this up is because a lot of places have various names. When I was working for the post office, I was part of address management. And you would believe this, but when you put it in the computer, you got to put in any possible variation of an address so that the computers know where to send your mail. And if you don't get your mail, it's because the computer's made an error. That's it. Just kidding. But in places, there were some streets that had 6 variable names. So you had to put them all in. Not everybody uses those names, and not everybody knew all those names, but it was part of my job to know them all. So fun with that. The reason I say that is because we're dealing with the Sea of Tiberias. That was fun information. When you walk out of here, forget it. There were 7 disciples in attendance. We know who they are because they're listed very easily to us in verse 2. If you look at the names, they all had something to do with fishing. In the original, Matthew's not listed there. Matthew was a tax gatherer. Simon the Zealot wasn't there. He was the zealot, kind of thing. I don't know if Thaddeus was or was not there. I don't know what they were doing. So you get pretty much the idea. So let me kind of give you a brief outline for the chapter so you know where we're going. Hopefully, get most of this knocked off this morning. Decision to go fishing. Manifestation of Jesus. The miracle catch. Breakfast on the beach. I was going to say breakfast at Tiffany's, but it didn't fit into any of the names for the lake. Directions to Peter, and then the conclusion of the Gospel of John. So let's talk about the decision to go fishing. I like that. It's a good spin caster. Peter says something very simple. He says, I'm going fishing. It's a simple statement. Nothing fancy about it. He doesn't give you his pretense for it. He doesn't give you any reason for it. It was a statement that we could say was Peter saying, Jesus, I'm done with following Jesus. I'm going back in business. Could we say that? I would say no. Because the reason is Jesus never chastised them for doing this. He actually tells them how to go catch fish. Okay, so, which is good because he had taken these guys, and we'll talk about it in a moment, and made them fishers of men. So did they lose their ability to catch fish? It really isn't super talented. Today it's so easy. If any of you have ever seen any of these fishing shows, they got these super complex sonar, and they could find fish anywhere. My job to find fish is I'd look over the boat and say, not there. We keep moving. You would fish for a while and not catch anything and say, hey, there's no fish here. And the fish are probably writing you off anyway. You don't know until you actually catch them. But today it's It's simple. Back then, remember, they're fishing. They weren't, I know there's a rod and reel up here. They weren't fishing with rod and reel. They were fishing with a huge cast net, which takes talent itself to use one of those things. But we do know if they were back in business, catching no fish is not good for business. It's just not going to work out that way. It's not even good for you because you won't eat anything. You'll have nothing to eat. And as we look at this, just think for a moment. Was Peter wrong for going back to fishing? And we have to think this through because I've heard a lot of people that want to preach through this and say, oh, look how awful Peter was. He failed Jesus. He denied him 3 times, and now he's going fishing. Well, Peter was in every appearance that Jesus made to the disciples. Peter was excited when he was told that the tomb was empty. He ran with John. John was a little bit quicker, got to the tomb, stopped. Peter blew by and went in. He was super excited. So we got to ask ourselves, first of all, is it sinful to fish? I'm going to ask you that point blank. And the answer is, be careful with your answer. You know? It's not sinful generically to fish or to have a fishing business. Jesus never, and here's the thing that I think is the key, is Jesus never condemns their action. Would be a good opportunity to say, hey guys, sit down. I got to give you an exhortation. What you're doing is wrong. You need to go back out and do this. And that's not what happens. And other disciples are in agreement with it. What's with this? What's going on? I would ask a question. Did they need to eat? Did they have a right to earn a living? And I would say both those are really good. Yes, they need to eat, and they have a right to earn a living. How would they earn a living if they were going to go out in full-time ministry, which they were told to do? How would they earn a living? Well, they had to do various things. Yes, people would help them, but Paul was a tent maker, right? Peter, this was often overlooked. Peter was a fisherman. Paul was a tent maker. Paul was also a Pharisee. He dropped being a Pharisee, but he still kept making tents. It was a lucrative business. So he kept doing that. However, it's not what they're told to do in Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28, they're told to go and go to Galilee and wait for him. And now they are in Galilee, but they're not waiting for him. And I think there's nothing wrong, however, when we talk about this. But again, Jesus is going to use this incident to manifest who he is. And I think that's even a better picture. Because just like in John chapter 9, which does say, did this man or his parents sin that he was born blind? Which I find very funny. Because the man sinned and then was born blind. It's a crazy question. But you see in that case, Jesus says, no, I'm going to use this for my glory. And I think the same thing's here. He's going to use this incident for his glory. They caught nothing, which I think as a fisherman, fishing all night is quite disappointing. They had no food. They had no catch. They had nothing to sell. And this failure sets the stage for what Jesus is going to do to instruct his disciples and to manifest himself. So in this vignette, this picture of failure, Jesus will display who he is. They caught nothing. And I want you to understand that, what was going on here. They caught nothing at the end of verse 3. And that has to be very defeating. This was their moment to say, we're going to go back and do what we've always done. They were proficient at this. Before they were called to be disciples, they were all most of them were fishermen. They were from that area. And now he goes, they go out and catch nothing. I don't know how many times they cast that huge net, which is in it of itself is very fatiguing. If you've ever seen anybody casting those huge nets, they're very physical people. These are strong guys. And I believe what they're going to be taught is as disciples going to become apostles, their ministry had to lean fully on Jesus, who cares and provides and protects them. And they're going to see that through this time on the beach. So that we're going to see a manifestation of Jesus. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Jesus therefore said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" They answered, "No." So this is the third time Jesus manifests himself to his disciples. The first time was in Galilee, and this is the first time in Galilee. The other two were in Jerusalem. And we see Jesus standing on the beach, which I find just a fascinating. Picture yourself out in the Sea of Galilee, quite a distance, probably a couple hundred yards at least, and you're looking back and you see a figure out there just standing on the beach. Now, I've had the pleasure of being out early in the morning, standing on the Sea of Galilee, and being one of the only ones standing, not on the sea, at the sea, on the seashore. I don't want you thinking I was walking on water. And it's a very quiet, peaceful place. It's just very beautiful in the morning. But you don't see that far because, remember, you're below sea level. Okay? And the ability to see a long distance is kind of difficult. And I did see somebody way out fishing, but that was much further than 200 yards. All I saw was somebody out there kind of fishing. And I wanted to say, "Cast your net on the others." No. But they didn't know it was Jesus. And I don't think it had to do with it. Did he look different? Jesus is on the shore, and they're simply fishing in a boat. So they were a distance away. It was morning, dusk. I don't know where exactly what city they were. It just says they were on the Sea of Tiberias. It doesn't tell us what city, so I don't know if they were looking east, west, north, or south. And morning would be the sunrise would be coming up just like it does here. It comes up in the east. It comes up in the east everywhere, just so you know. That's scientific fact. Sets in the west. So I don't know which way they were looking. If they were looking into the rising sun, it would have been more difficult to see that. I also think expectation of Jesus being on the shore was not high. They were busy doing something. The Greek word used here, oda, means fully known or to recognize. Maybe they did not know, maybe did not know is not the best choice for this. Maybe they did not fully know or recognize Jesus. And I think that's where we're at. They didn't recognize it was Jesus, and basically what we have here is Jesus then says something. They caught no fish, having fished all night. And Jesus asked a question, a very pointed question. When I first read this, I said, if I was out there and somebody yelled out to me, "Hey, kids, I guess you didn't catch anything," I would have been a little, perturbed. You know what I'm saying? No kidding. I also would have said, "How do you know that? You've been watching me all night? How would you know I didn't catch anything? I've been out here for quite a while." And it's interesting because if you read it in the original, it says, "Little children, do you have any food?" Would probably be best in context. Not that they didn't have any fish, but they didn't have anything, they didn't catch anything to eat. And this is the only time ever in all the Gospels that Jesus calls his disciples little children. Now, my version says children, but it really means little children, paideon. This is a word used for infants or kids. When they searched for Jesus as a baby or a toddler in Matthew chapter 2, that word is used, paideon. In Matthew 19:13, they brought children to him for him to lay hands on them and pray for them. That's the only times it's really used of in the Gospels, but it's used of actual children. Now he calls them little children. Now, one commentator called this divine sarcasm. Then he continues and says, "Here were 7 grown men, divinely selected by sovereign creator of the universe, to proclaim to all the world that Jesus died for the sins of the world and rose again." Jesus calls them little boys. Still better, you have baby teeth. I believe there's more here than that. I believe this is a term of endearment. How better to refocus these disciples and call them little children. Now remember, these disciples were probably not that old. And I always think age is relevant. You know, it depends on which direction you're looking in a crowd, you know, kind of thing. You could be one of the older ones or the younger ones. It depends on who you're hanging with. But Jesus is actually manifesting himself to them, and they need to understand they are his children. Look with me at 1 John real quick. 1 John. Because John likes to use this word. 1 John chapter 2. We're going to go from 1 John chapter 2, then we're going to go over to Proverbs, so you know where we're going. 1 John chapter 2, verse 13 says, I am writing to you, fathers, because you know him who has been from the beginning. I'm writing to you, young men, because you have overcome the evil one. I have written to you, children, little children, because you know the Father. So again, and in verse 18, let's just read verse 18. Little children, little instructed ones. That's why I wrote in my Bible. Little instructed ones. It is the last hour, just as you heard. The Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have risen. From this, we know that it is the last hour. So many people anti to Christ, teaching false doctrines that had risen. And he wants his children to be protected. John has spiritual children. He's writing to protect them. That's a good thing, right? Proverbs 22. Proverbs chapter 22. Jesus is dealing with these disciples as children. They need to understand that they are his children. They need to understand as children who and what he is as they're being prepared to be sent out. And here's an interesting verse, and many of you have heard it in Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So the idea of child rearing with a directed goal that you're going to teach a child in the direction they need to go. What's Jesus doing? He's rearing children. He's dealing with his disciples as children, and they do not have any food. They don't have anything to eat. Fish here is implied, but he's concerned about their welfare, their need to eat. And they caught nothing, which sets them up for verse 6. This verse 6 is a miracle. A miracle. A miracle. So much of a miracle, they count the fish. Now I'm going to tell you something. When I went on fishing trips, you count the fish. The only thing about a fishing trip that usually changed was not how many fish you caught, but the size of the fish. They usually went from this to grandiose. But when we talk about this miracle, this is how Jesus is going to manifest himself. He has control over the fish themselves. And the instruction is simple. To many fishermen, the instruction doesn't make any sense. Now, I don't know the size of Peter's boat, because it says little boat later, and little boat is relevant, right? I've seen many size, what we would call professional boats that go out to shrimp. Shrimper boats are huge. They don't go out to catch 2 shrimp. They go out to get millions and millions of shrimp so that you can have all you can eat at wherever you're going. But when he says to them in 21 verse 6, cast the net on the right side of the boat, he wasn't trying to say, which I always thought funny, what's the right side of the boat? Because we've already been fishing on the wrong side of the boat. You know, I didn't know there's a right side. If I would have known that, I would have been fishing on the right side. Now, to be funny though, not to be funny, he said put it on the right side. Were they fishing on the right side the first time? Because the assumption is they were fishing on the left side. I have no idea. To be honest with you, it just says do it on the right side. Jesus is giving them direct, clear commands. It may have been the same side they've been fishing all night, which would have really been really annoying. Like we've been doing that all night. And I'm trying to figure out, in a decent-sized little boat, does the side matter? It really doesn't. It may be annoying if you're in a party boat with somebody and you're catching fish and standing next to you is a guy that can't catch anything. But that's just right place, right time. But here's what's interesting. They had fished all night. And it really doesn't matter because a fisherman, just from trial and error, will try any side of the boat, probably all night long. But in this case, remember, this is exactly what Jesus tells them to do. Now let's kind of regroup and get an understanding of what this is. He says, cast your net. Now just so you know, this isn't, don't say it fast, because when I was a kid I thought it was so funny. Castanets. They were the Spanish fishermen. But the word cast in Greek is balo. And most of you know what balo is. You throw a ball. So it's easy to remember. Balo is throw or cast. He's giving them in an imperative. He's commanding them, hey guys, for your benefit, cast your net on the right side of the boat. It's for your benefit. Do this event and you'll be benefited. And not only that, the Lord directs them with his guidance to say what side. I'm going to put them right there, right under the right side. I think it's interesting because that didn't change. They'll get a great haul of fish. It was right under the boat the whole time. They were avoiding the nets? No. Jesus brought them to that place to do this. Thirdly, when we talk about this idea of cast, if they do this, they will find, notice what it says, if you cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find a catch. The word find there, ready for this, is where we get our word eureka from. Throw your net right side of the boat. Eureka! We found fish. And they cast the net into the boat. And how it reads then, they cast therefore in verse 6, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Wow. It's fascinating. Again, I'm going to say this throughout. John uses a lot of words kind of interchangeable. In verse 5, he says, do you have any fish? The word used there is prosphagon. Prosphagon basically can be fish or food, but aren't fish food? So it's kind of like, you get the understanding? He says food, but what are they doing in the water? Are they catching buffalo? You know, we know they're catching fish, and fish is the food. So John uses that word. But verses 6 and 8, he uses a different word, ichthys. And ichthys is where they get that little fish in the back of people's cars, what we call the Christian fish. I don't know why it's a Christian fish. His tail isn't closed, but the Christian fish, that what comes from that, some of you may call it the Jesus fish. Ever heard that? It's what it means, what it's come to mean is it takes each letter and it says, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Fun. That was fun fact. I don't have one and don't plan on getting one. But here's the interesting thing. In verses 9 and 10, there's the third word for fish. He uses oparsion. Oparsion means like small fish to eat, like sardines. Those kind of, or bigger than sardines, little fish. Herring, those kind of things. And then you go to verse 11, and 11 uses a different word for a different understanding of ichthys, basically saying large fish. The reason I'm bringing this up is because throughout John's gospel in chapter 21, it goes back and forth with different words for different things that really are talking about the same idea. Ichthys basically is the general term for fish of various sizes. When we get to 9 or 10, Jesus is already on the shore cooking smaller fish. Where did he get those from? He may have used the pocket fishermen. Just called them forth and he jumped into the fire. And then he asked the disciple to bring out of the catch the smaller fish. Now, I know this for a fact. No matter how big your fish get, when you catch fish, they're various sizes. Okay? So that's why the different uses for fish are there. However, they couldn't haul it in. They couldn't draw in fish. There are so many, they couldn't bring them in. Then this cry is made in verse 7. The disciple, therefore, whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." It's the Lord. It's the Lord. And I know it's John. We're not going to sit here for argument's sake to take time on that. But how did John say this? Did he see any better all of a sudden? Or did John look at the manifestation of what Jesus had done and say, that has to be Jesus on the shore? That's the Lord. And I believed John understood that this miracle pointed to who Jesus was. The manifestation was clear. All these things added up, and John pointed out it's Jesus. John probably vocalized what most of them were thinking, because he was the one who instructed them on how to do it, what to do, and what would happen, providing this large haul of fish. Then Peter jumps in. Now, I'm going to tell you something which was really underrated in the Bible. Most of these guys in the Bible that we see, especially in the New Testament times, were very physical people. They walked miles upon miles. They could swim. They were, again, in this case, they were fishing. They were very apt in pulling in large hauls of fish. It's a very physical job. I know in some texts it says Peter put on his outer garment because he was stripped naked for his job. I don't think that's exactly what it means. The word naked there could be various things. I don't think Peter was fishing and his all together is all together. Anybody ever remember that? From Hans Christian Andersen in the Emperor's New Clothes. The idea here is, and that would be nice for color if he was fishing naked, but that's just weird. I don't know if you say, well, it's a custom of the times. No, any times that would be weird, okay? I don't want to talk about the hook stories, but it's just dangerous. It's normal, and it's normal at that time to do certain things that I would say that would be take off as much clothing as you can, because it's very physical. You don't want to get if you're wearing a robe and an outer robe and all these other garments and get them wet, you can't move. So he's probably in his, what would you say, his loincloth, basically. And to most people, I'd say he's naked. Why is he like that? The word doesn't always mean naked, though, so just be honest. It can mean poorly dressed. Jesus will say, when you saw me naked, did you do anything for me? Now, Jesus isn't talking about naked people running the streets, go clothe them, because they're usually not well. He's talking about people poorly clothed. Did you take care of them? James kind of brings up the same thing. You take care of the wealthy in your congregation. When the poor guy comes in, you make him sit in the front of someone's footstool. The idea is, again, do we take it literal or do we take it not so literal? And I say stay with it not so literal. He was just poorly clothed when fishing. But he could not wait till the boat reached the shore, and he swims to Jesus, which again, if it's 200 to 300 yards out, it's a 600-foot, it's a 2 football field swim. Now, when I was a Boy Scout, I got to swim a mile for a merit badge. They didn't tell me the water temperature to be like just above frigid. It was a real difficult night to get through that. And the color purple I came up with was not good. But I had trained for a long time to swim a mile. I couldn't swim 50 feet right now if I wanted to. Do you understand? These guys were well trained. Peter swimming that distance was nothing. He beats the boat ashore. And so they were a ways out. And it says in verse 8 that this is a little boat. The other disciples came in a little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 100 yards. Now, how long did it take in? How long did it take Peter to get there and for the boat to arrive at the shore? I don't know, but the boat is now missing a guy to get it in. I don't know what the prevailing wind was. I don't know how many of them were actually rowing your boat ashore. Michael, row your boat ashore. I don't know how many of them were rowing the boat ashore, dragging 153 fish in a net, because they couldn't bring it on the boat. So that's got to be hard. Anybody ever read, what was the Old Man in the Sea? By the time he got in with that large fish, it was nothing. Okay, it wasn't, you couldn't bring that large fish onto the boat. So the idea here is pretty much they had cast a net, now they're dragging a net. And these were strong men, and they brought the haul in, and then the disciples come ashore. And I think that's kind of interesting. When they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed on with bread. So Jesus had prepared breakfast already. It was already there. Jesus asked if they had any food. And no, they didn't, but he could provide any food. Where did Jesus get the provisions? Now, I think it's kind of interesting. Let's talk about the providing of provisions. Is this the same God who gave the children of Israel in the wilderness manna from heaven? I believe this was manna on the beach. He just provided it. Maybe maybe they needed, these disciples needed him to provide for them. They brought in what he had provided, but he still provided above that. Jesus also shows he can provide a miracle of catch, and he can provide a miracle for their needs. He would take care of them. He said, I will take care of you. We could spend a long time going through the upper room discourse, which starts in the upper room but ends up at the Garden of Gethsemane in John 13 through 17, and show what Jesus was going to do. He even prepares them for his leaving. He would send the Holy Spirit. Jesus is now revealing to them who he is, that he's alive, he's resurrected, and he's still going to provide for them, he's still going to guide them, and he's still going to direct them. And then he says to them, bring some of your fresh fish that you caught. Let's have a real party. Bring on more. We got enough room on this fire for more fish. Then Simon Peter drew 153 fish to the beach. That's what it says in verse 11. Simon Peter went up, drew the net to land full. I'm sure the other guys were helping him, but Simon Peter was in charge of the activity again. And Simon drew the net to land full of fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. Which again is, I don't know, ever been in a place and you walk in, and I do this at some places, I see this little sign that says, limit, and they tell you how many people are allowed to be in the place, the restaurant or the facility you're in. And I don't know what happens if the restaurant says we can hold 96, and the 97th person shows up, do they kick them out? So I don't know if this net had a 152 fish limit. At an 153, it would rip, and it didn't rip. I don't know. Well, it's just something to think about. But it's just a statement of facts. That's all we have. The facts is they caught 153 fish, and the net didn't break. I wanted to come up with something, every time I study John, I want to come up with something so fascinating about 153. You go through all the scripture, where is 153 mentioned? Then I do the math. What is it divided by? Can I make this, 10 disciples and this guy and add them all up and that's it, 150. You can't do any kind of math and come up with 153. It's the only time it's mentioned in scripture, 153. And I came up with this over-the-top, fantastic, profound thought. Ready? It's 153 fish because they counted them. And it was probably the biggest haul they ever had. And they had to count it. They go, guys, look at this. This is great. We got a significant number of fish, 153. Let's mark it down. You ever seen video games where they used to have on places you could actually play video games? I don't know if they have them anymore. Arcades, they used to be called. And there was a high score posted. And he said, I'm going to beat that high score. No matter what I'm doing, I'm pinball. I'm going to be a pinball wizard. I'm going to break that high score. And you aim for that high score. Pac-Man, they used to post it for Pac-Man all the time. Beat that high score. I want to be the high score holder. Well, they got the high score, 153. That's it. That was as simple as that. And then they have, breakfast on the beach. And this is where we'll finish, because next week we'll pick up with Peter's discussion with Jesus, because there's a lot of explaining to do, and at the end of the day, I'm going to unexplain what I explained. I'm going to teach it and then unteach it. Okay? Verse 14 through 12 through 14 says, Jesus said to them, "Come have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question him. "Who are you?" Knowing it was the Lord. Why say, "Who are you, Lord"? Wouldn't that kind of be silly? He had accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. They knew it was him. It was provable to them. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave them, and the fish likewise. Again, they had a long night. This has been a long night for them. And in the early morning, they're exhausted. They now had to bring in a net full of fish. And they had to cast it on the right side, do exactly what Jesus said. They brought in a very significant haul of fish. And my little pea brain says, what do you do with 153 fish? Well, they had plenty to take to the market and sell. And that's just an assumption I'm making, because Jesus isn't going to let you catch them and just let them die on the beach. That would be kind of silly. But here's what Jesus does. He points to them to understand that he gave them fish. He gave them bread. He would sustain them. He would take care of them. The Lord would provide. Isn't that brought forth in the Old Testament for the very beginning? When Abraham brought Isaac up to the mountain to sacrifice his son, and there he called the place where the Lord would provide. Isn't that brought forth as the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness, that he would provide and they would still grumble over the Lord's food? He's the Lord. He gave them bread, and they took it, and fish too. And notice what it says in verse 14. This is the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he had been raised from the dead. Very clearly saying that Jesus had been manifested time and time again by revealing to his disciples who he is. Let's go through just two of them other than this one. He had come to them and shown them his nail imprints, but not only in his hands, but in his side. He said, "It's me." They believed. They didn't touch him. They saw. They believed. Later, they're gathered together again after telling Thomas what happened. And then he goes up to Thomas and says the same thing. So those two occasions, he's showing to them who he is, and they believe that he is resurrected. He is the Lord. And they go off, like I said last class, they go off with this gospel of him being alive and resurrected. Now, they're going to go out. From this part on, we're going to see them being sent into the world to teach the whole world, and they're going to get a commission to do so. And how will they do that? And I find it fascinating, just for a prelude to what we're going to see next week. Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John." I find that interesting. Simon, son of John. That's the only place in the whole Bible that it says, Simon, son of John. We know who Peter's dad is. John. Who's Peter's friend? John. Peter doesn't have to know many names. Jesus and John. I'm pretty good with that. But just think about that. That name really means, ready for this? They're on the beach. This is just fun. Simon the fisherman, his father's name is Jonah. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time as we've looked at this wonderful discourse that Jesus is giving to his disciples as he provides a miracle to prove and show again who he is. Another sign that's not always accounted for in the book of John, that John writes about all these signs, and Jesus here does a sign of the miracle of the fish that the disciples so needed to see, that their Savior and Lord would take care of them, sustain them, and guide them. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be